Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the most quoted figures in American history. He is also one of the most selectively quoted. The version most people encounter, the dreamer, the unifier, the figure safe enough to put on a federal holiday, is real. It is also incomplete. In 1964, King published Why We Can't Wait. In it, and in the letter he wrote from a Birmingham jail cell the year before, he identified the specific obstacle he believed was most responsible for slowing the movement. It was not the Klan. It was not the open segregationist. It was the white moderate. This video is about that argument, what he meant by it, why he made it, and what the decades since suggest about whether he was right. By 1963, the civil rights movement had been building for nearly a decade. The Supreme Court had ruled school segregation unconstitutional in 1954. The Montgomery bus boycott had ended in victory in 1956. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches had sustained pressure across the South. Progress had been made, and it had been slow, partial, and consistently met with calls for patience from people who considered themselves allies. Birmingham, Alabama in the spring of 1963 was the movement's deliberate pressure point. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference chose it specifically because of its resistance. And because of its sheriff, Bull Connor, whose response to peaceful protest with fire hoses and police dogs made the stakes of inaction visible to the entire country. King was arrested during the Birmingham campaign and held in the city jail. A white Alabama clergyman, moderate, not hostile, published an open letter calling the protests unwise and untimely. They were not segregationists. They expressed sympathy with the goals of the movement. They asked for patience. King's response, written in the margins of a newspaper and on scraps of paper from his cell, became the letter from Birmingham jail. Why We Can't Wait was built around it. King's argument in the letter is precise. The greatest obstacle to justice, he wrote, was not the person who opposed it openly, it was the person who claimed to support it but valued order above it. The white moderate, in King's framing, preferred what he called a negative peace, the absence of tension, over a positive peace, which requires the presence of justice. The distinction matters. A negative peace looks like calm. It produces nothing. The clergymen who prompted the letter were not unusual. Their position, "We support your goals, we oppose your methods, please wait," was the dominant position among self-described moderates across the country. King's response was that waiting was not a neutral act. Every delay had a cost. Every call for patience absorbed the pressure that structural change required. The legislative record of the following decades reflects the pattern King described. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 represented genuine structural progress, the result of sustained, uncomfortable pressure that the movement had built over years. After that peak, the pattern shifted. Subsequent decades produced measures that addressed symptoms without restructuring the conditions that produced them. Poverty rates in black communities, which had been declining through the mid-60s, stalled. The wealth gap widened. The problems King named remained because the pressure required to address them structurally was no longer being sustained, and the moderate preference for incremental, manageable change had largely prevailed. King's case for direct action is not primarily a moral argument. It is a structural one. Tension, in his framework, is not a side effect of the push for justice, it is the mechanism. Comfortable systems do not restructure themselves. The negotiating table is only reached when the cost of staying away from it becomes higher than the cost of sitting down. The Birmingham campaign was designed on this principle. The choice of Birmingham was not incidental. The choice of tactics, marches, sit-ins, filling the jails, was not incidental. The goal was to make the existing order visibly, undeniably costly to maintain. Not to provoke violence, but to make the violence that was already present impossible to ignore or defer. King addressed the objection directly in the letter. The criticism was that direct action created tension. His answer was that the tension already existed. direct action made it visible. The alternative, waiting for change through negotiation and goodwill, had been tried for the preceding decade and had produced incremental movement at the cost of structural change. Visibility, in his argument, was not the problem. It was the only available solution. What happens when the tension stops is observable. The years following the legislative gains of the mid-60s saw the energy of direct action dissipate, and with it, the pressure that had produced those gains. The problems that remained were addressed with the tools the moderate had always preferred: targeted programs, incremental adjustments, measures that reduced the most visible symptoms without altering the conditions underneath. King had named this outcome in advance. He called it a negative peace. The argument King made in Why We Can't Wait was not that progress was impossible. It was that progress required a specific kind of pressure, applied consistently, towards structural ends, and that the moderate preference for order over that pressure would produce exactly the result it had always produced: enough movement to quiet the demand, not enough to resolve the problem. The pattern he described has a 60-year record now. The legislative high point of the mid-1960s has not been matched. Poverty in black communities remains disproportionate by every measurable index. The wealth gap between black and white households is wider today than it was in 1968. The mechanisms King identified, the preference for negative peace, the absorption of pressure through partial measures, the consistent prioritization of stability over structural change, did not disappear when the movement's visibility faded. They became the default. King was not predicting failure. He was describing the specific conditions under which progress would stall, and offering a precise account of what would have to change for it not to. Why We Can't Wait is 60 years old. The question it poses has not changed. King's argument in Why We Can't Wait did not begin with a white moderate. It began with a set of principles about justice, courage, and what Christianity actually demanded of its followers, principles he had been developing and writing about for years before Birmingham. In the next video in this series, we go further into those foundations. There is more to King's written work than most people encounter, and the ideas in it are not finished.